Now, North Point is one of the top 3 largest churches in the US, with more than 42,000 people in attendance every single week before COVID. And my job at North Point was to pastor the people who connected with our church through social media, through YouTube, through podcasts, through email, through our website. Now, to give you just a really quick idea of what that looked like, every single week at North Point, we had about 900,000 people who downloaded our message podcast. We had about 90,000 people who watched our messages via our website or our app. We had about 70,000 people who watched our services live streamed every single week. We had about 250,000 people who watched our YouTube content every week. And collectively, we had about 1 million followers on social media. So you can imagine stepping into this role as the online and social media pastor, it was a bit overwhelming. I remember after my first week on the job, I worked Sunday through Thursday, and I came home Thursday night, and my wife said to me, "Hey, how was the first week? Like, are you loving this role?" And I said to her, I kind of feel like a mosquito in a nudist colony. Because I know exactly what I need to do, but I don't know where to begin. And she said to me, "Please don't ever say that publicly." And I said, "I promise I'm never going to share that publicly." But it was extremely overwhelming. And now, as was mentioned, I work for an organization called Orange, and I actually just flew in from Atlanta 2 days ago after being at the Orange Conference, where we had 8,500 people at Gwinnett Arena come to learn about how to rethink their church strategy. And I had the opportunity to share about digital ministry with these people. And I also led and hosted the online stream, where we had about 1,500 people watching the live stream across 3.5 days. So we had this unique opportunity to connect and share with thousands of churches. And I know in church world, it's easy for us to get caught up in these sorts of numbers, right? It's easy for us to think that bigger is always better. But from my experience as an online pastor for nearly 15 years, numbers only matter because people count. Numbers only matter because people count, and each number represents a person. So my job at North Point was to leverage technology, to build relationships, to build engagements. My goal was to give people who watched our services online a window into our church, but also to create a doorway into community. I wanted to leverage technology to build connections, to help people grow in their faith, and to help the church be there in people's moment of greatest need. In this way, I was just trying to use the technology of our day in the same way that the Apostle Paul used the technology of his day. Paul used the technology of his day to connect people with God. Now, the technology of Paul's day was letter writing. For those of you who are under the age of 30, letter writing is when you take a pen and you press it onto paper and you move your wrist around to create letters. That was the technology of Paul's day. And I believe that the church now more than ever before in this postmodern, post-Christian world we live in, we need to use the technology of our day to do the same thing, to connect people with each other and with God. And in order to do that, we need to wrestle with 2 key things when it comes to online communication and digital ministry. The first is we have to understand that technology is not going away. It's not like Amazon is suddenly going to close up shop and say, "Hey, we're done. We're not going to sell anymore." And it's not like people are going to stop going online. In fact, with AI and all the tools and devices that are coming out, it's only going to happen more and more. And the second thing we have to wrestle with is that people have been turning their back on the church for decades. Even before COVID hit, more people were attending less or not attending at all. According to every study I've seen from around the world, people who attend church have stopped attending church. People who attend church, even those who would say that they follow Jesus, they've stopped attending church. In 2019, before COVID, before the pandemic, before lockdowns, polls in Australia by McKinsey and in the US by Gallup showed that only 22% of Christians attended church services every week. Outside of that, they were following along via podcasts or live streams. And data released by the Australian Bureau of Statistics just last year indicated there was still a massive decline in people who are even identified as Christians, which had dropped by 20% from the last decade. All of this together, it just seems that the church is becoming increasingly irrelevant. But, as my friend Karen Newhoff says, just because the gospel is always relevant, it doesn't mean you are. And we need to figure out new ways to be relevant. And here's the thing, while weekly attendance was declining before 2019, the number of people who were accessing our church content via social media, via podcasts, via YouTube, via live streams, via websites, and via apps was up. It was increasing. The numbers there were going up and to the right. Even before the pandemic, numbers in Australia and around the world showed that there were people increasingly connecting with our church content by watching live streams while they're on vacation, by listening to podcasts while they're on their commute, by watching apps and YouTube while they're standing in line at the supermarket or at the bank. In this way, church attendance has not been decreasing, it's been decentralizing. Now, I get it. I understand that as church leaders and as pastors, this can be really hard for us to hear. And we have to start figuring out why it's so hard for us to hear. I think in a lot of ways, I think that unfortunately, it's hard for us to hear this or accept this because we often measure our success and determine our value and our self-worth based on how many people are sitting in front of us at a service. Right? If we're really honest, that's a big part of why we want to push back on some of this stuff. And we even go as far to try to justify that by leveraging Hebrews 10:25, and let us not give up, let us not neglect our meeting together. Now, I'm not saying that in any way should online ever replace on-site. I've never met an online pastor who believed that online could or should replace what happens on-site. But the data shows that people are connecting and they are gathering. They're just not doing it as often or in our church buildings as previous. But we also know that there are a whole bunch of people in our local church communities who don't know Jesus at all, who probably don't even know that your church exists. What do we do about them? And this is why, for me, online digital ministry is not a Hebrews 10:25 issue, it's a Mark 16 issue. Because Mark 16, we're told to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every living creature. Jesus told his followers, that's all of us, to go into the world. And in the modern day world, the post-Christian world, all the world includes Facebook, it includes YouTube, it includes social media, it includes podcasts, it includes text and WhatsApp and DMs, and it includes emails. You see, we have to come to the conclusion that this thing that we all carry in our pockets every single day means that everybody who lives in the community that you're trying to reach right now through your church carries with them in their pocket a pulpit, a small group, a worship team, and an offering plate. Our goal then, as church leaders, is to take this device and turn it from a tool for distraction into a tool for discipleship. That's our goal. That needs to be our purpose. That needs to be what we're aiming for as much as possible. But instead, most churches that I work with around the world end up just using this technology, these platforms, to promote events and to talk about themselves. And the thing is, you don't make disciples by using technology to invite people to events, but by using technology to invite people to life-changing conversations. We have to make that fundamental shift. And that shift starts by understanding that, again, in this postmodern, post-Christian world that we are called to serve and to reach, we have to understand that context is king. Now, you may have heard that content is king when it comes to online, but in 2023, context is king. Posting content that is contextualized to the community you're trying to reach, to the people you're trying to share the gospel with, that's what makes a difference. You see, content will make a post, but context will make a difference. Anybody can post content. In fact, churches are really good at posting random pieces of content that the rest of the community doesn't understand because we're making it all about us. We're making it all about ourselves. How good our service was, how good our outreach is, how loving our community is, which is all important and it's all true. But if we met at a party and all I did was talk about myself, how good I am, how good the stuff I've been doing is, what I've got planned for next week, and didn't ask you any questions about yourselves, you would all probably switch off and think, this guy's a jerk. And you'd be right. Yet too often, as church leaders, as church organizations, this is exactly what people see when they follow us on social media or if they stumble onto us in social media. But creating content that has a purpose, creating content that has influence, creating content that allows us to share the gospel, that's where context comes in. But unfortunately, too many churches are answering questions that no one is asking. Instead, instead of doing this, we need to be answering the questions that the people in the community that we serve, the people, the families, the business owners, the students who live within driving distance of our building, we need to be answering the questions that they're actually asking about faith, about God, about Jesus, about Sabbath, about life, about relationships, about purpose and hope. That's when we start to make a difference, when we contextualize it to the community that God has called us to serve in. One of the things that I've been working with recently with churches and ministries right around the world is this project called the Top 100 Faith Questions, where I'm helping them find the top 100 most frequently asked questions online in their local community, whether that's California, whether that's Fiji, or whether that's Sydney. The top 100 questions that people are asking online. And when churches find out that information, they're able to start posting content that is actually helpful and relevant to the people in their community, because we're answering the questions that they're actually asking, not just the ones we think or we hope that they are asking. This is where context is king. This is where context starts to make a huge difference. And if you've ever found yourself as a church leader wondering, hey, what am I going to post this week? Like, I've got to post something because I know I have to get that done. If you want to post content that doesn't just get social media done, but gets social media results, find out what the top 100 faith questions are in your local community and start answering those. That helps create that content. That will create that schedule for you. But we also need to understand that it's not 2008 anymore. It's not 2013 anymore. In 2023, people understand, or at least start to understand, we need to start understanding that the internet is not a broadcast medium anymore, but it's a narrowcast medium. Too often, we still think that it's broadcast. I'm going to broadcast everything out, and we have this spray and pray approach to social media and to YouTube and to all the content that we have, right? We put as much out there as we possibly can, we broadcast as much as we can, and we just pray that something lands. But the internet has become a narrowcast medium because we now have the ability to target the people who live within driving distance of our church. The community that God called us to reach, right? That you're a local church pastor for a reason. You're a local church for a reason, and that's to reach the locals who live within driving distance of your building. And you're able to do that now if you take this approach that online, social media, YouTube, it can be a narrow cast medium. So what does all this mean? Well, being narrowcast means that we can't just post content and spray and pray, but we have to actually take time to comment, to respond, to engage with the people who follow us. It might even mean that we start following all of the local businesses and all the local schools and all the local emergency services in our community so that we can get involved in the conversations that they are having. And when that starts to happen, what we start to realize is that social media is not a megaphone, one-way communication. Social media is a telephone. It's two-way communication, where we can post something and somebody responds, but how often do we just neglect that and just not respond back? We need to engage ourselves in those conversations. You know, somebody talked about yesterday or last night, how do we get more engagement on social media? I think this is the key. We need to stop using it as one-way communication, start seeing it as two-way communication, and remember that social media is social, and that requires conversations. Start leveraging your social media, your YouTube content to create conversations, and then engage in those conversations. Don't just let them lie fallow. Make your content accessible to the people that you're trying to reach. You know, if you're just posting your YouTube content from your message online, and I don't know how long you speak for at your church or how long your pastor goes for. I know the average message in the US is 37 minutes. And the reality is the average person is not going to watch 37-minute piece of content on YouTube. Part of the reason for that is most people access YouTube on their cell phones. And so they're not going to watch a 37-minute message. And if I'm in your local town and I'm going to your church and I go to my neighbor and ask how he or she is doing, and they say, hey, my marriage is falling apart, I don't know what to do with my life. It's really hard for me to go, well, my pastor actually did a 37-minute message on how to save your marriage. Let's watch it together on the porch right now on my phone, right? Doesn't make sense. But if we can start to narrowcast and start to understand how people access content, then what we'll start to do is we'll take that 37-minute piece of content, we'll post that to YouTube, yes, but then we'll also create a 4-minute version of the same video, just taking out one point or a highlight. And then when I go to my neighbor, I can say, hey, here's a really short clip that my pastor did about how to save your marriage. And then on that YouTube video, we're going to use end screens and cards and the description to point people to the 37-minute message. And then on the 37-minute message, we're going to have a YouTube card that comes up and that says, if you want to watch this message in 5 minutes, click here. And it's going to take them to the 4-minute version. And then we need to take that 4-minute version and create a 60-second version of it for one reason: post on social media. So then I can go to my neighbor and say, here's a 60-second tip on how you can save your marriage. That was really good. Can I watch more? Yeah, let me show you the 5-minute version of that. Well, that was good. Where do I find more? Let me send you a link to the 30. Do you see how it all works and it starts to take steps? We have to think steps. We have to think narrowcast. We have to think reaching the people who live within driving distance of our buildings. Now, I've done quite a few of these talks at various events, and one thing that I've learned, one thing that I know, when I speak to a crowd this size, one thing that I know is there are only about 3 or 4, while everybody agrees, everybody was nod and go, yeah, that's really good, there are probably only 3 or 4 churches who will actually do something about this, who will actually take something away and practically start posting content that is contextualized to the people who live in the local community that God's called you to serve. And I think part of the reason for this is resources. Some of us don't have those. But I think a bigger reason why there's only a small percentage of the churches represented in this room that are actually going to do something from this weekend, who are actually going to take something away from the speakers this weekend and make a change in the way they do online ministry. I think a bigger reason for that is something that author and pastor R.T. Kendall talks about when he says this: sometimes the greatest opposition to what God wants to do next comes from those who are on the cutting edge of what God did last. Sometimes the biggest hurdle we have to that we come up against and that we have to go through is that idea that, well, I was successful before, do I need to innovate now? I was reaching people before, do I need to change that? But if you want to, I think those churches, those 3 to 4 churches in this room who will take something away and actually apply it from this whole weekend, the people, those church leaders who are going to get out of the way of to allow what God's going to do next to actually come to fruition, they're the ones who are going to make the biggest difference in the world. They're the ones who are going to grow. They're the ones who are going to come back to this conference next year and go, hey, I listened to all of the speakers. I listened to Tim, I listened to Justin, and you know what? I applied it. And I've seen our church grow in influence in the local community. I've seen us reach more people than we've ever reached before. And we've shared the gospel one-on-one with more people than we've ever shared before because of what I learned at this conference.